Well, good morning. I'm here to talk about the Chamber's initiative to build a hyperloop between Oak Ridge and Knoxville, so we can just kind of go underneath the I-40. Actually, I don't, normally, I think probably a number of you have seen me talk about the lab before, and usually that involves a lengthy PowerPoint deck, which I'm not going to do this time. So if you're coming to see pretty pictures of happy scientists and stainless steel wrapped in tinfoil, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I thought instead what I'd do is talk a little bit about how the national labs more broadly are part of what you might call the innovation ecosystem that has really been important in characterizing the economic growth and dynamism of the U.S. economy going back to the end of the Second World War when Oak Ridge was first created, and then say a little bit about how that manifests itself in regions where the labs are located and kind of bring it back home. But certainly, if anywhere along the way you have any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt and ask me to clarify or explain, and I'll be happy to do that. So, as I said, Oak Ridge National Lab came out of the Manhattan Project in the Second World War, and I think most of you probably know that story, the so-called secret city. And there were three main facilities, of course, in Oak Ridge that had these code name designations: K25, Y12, and X10. Y12 is still an operating facility as part of our nation's national nuclear security complex and the nuclear deterrent. K25 was also a manufacturing facility, and during the war they were both focused on the enrichment of uranium, the production of materials to support the war effort. And they were big manufacturing enterprises in a totally new field of endeavor. And so it's not surprising that that manufacturing enterprise had to have an R&D component, just like, Dow Chemical or any other big production enterprise has an R&D component. And that R&D component was X10. Of course, it's X10 that became Oak Ridge National Lab. And at the end of the war, there was kind of a recognition by policymakers that something a little bit unusual had happened along the way to winning the war. And it wasn't just the decisive role that nuclear weapons played in ending the conflict in the Pacific, but there were a number of other examples, for example, radar, where fundamental science, very fundamental understanding how the universe works, that had been developed not that many years before the war, was in a very accelerated way brought to bear on solving important technological problems. So if you take the example of radar, the fundamentals of radar were really kind of worked out at the end of the 19th century with the discovery of Maxwell's equations and Faraday. In fact, Faraday, the British physicist, was asked at one point in time, what's the point of all of this research you're doing into electricity and magnetism and all these equations? What's the value going to be to the Exchequer? It was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically the Treasury Secretary of the UK, who was asking him this, and he says, well, I'm not sure, but I bet you'll tax it. And of course he was right. If you look at the effects of electrification on industry, it's been a huge wealth generator for society since the 19th century. But that same fundamental understanding of electricity and magnetism pointed the way to the development of radar. And actually, many of those early scientific developments occurred in the UK, because up until the Second World War, the scientific and technological powerhouses globally were basically Germany and Britain. That was where all the best scientists and engineers were working and the most important papers. It wasn't that there wasn't research going on everywhere, but the U.S. had been a kind of agrarian economy. It had been transitioning to a manufacturing economy, but it wasn't a high-tech economy in the same way. And our universities hadn't yet reached the stature that they have today, back in the 20s and 30s. So it was in the UK that a lot of that work had been done, and with people like Hertz in Germany. And the same thing is true in the nuclear science that spawned the Manhattan Project. It was, breakthroughs with people like Einstein and Fermi and so on, working in Europe, working in Germany, working in the UK. Now, of course, many of them came to the US as refugees, actually, because they were fleeing Nazi Germany, and they were facing religious persecution. And so there was this, the best form of tech transfer is the movement of people. So you had this big tech transfer from Germany to the US that kind of jump-started our role in the Manhattan Project. But the UK began work on radar, and they began work on a nuclear program, and realized that under the kind of conditions that they were trying to work, where there was, constant bombing from Germany, and all of their resources were really going into just kind of hold the line at the English Channel, they weren't going to be able to carry these things through. So there was an agreement reached between the US government and the UK government to say, okay, the US can take this role on. This was actually began before the US formally entered the war. And that's what led to this crash program with the Manhattan Project, and radar was developed at places like Lincoln Lab at MIT, where you mobilized the best resources of industry and academia to turn that fundamental science into something that was tremendously important for society. And certainly you can argue, I think with some good evidence, that the development of radar is ultimately what won the Battle of Britain that held Germany to the English Channel. Otherwise, that aerial bombardment and attack would have eventually, eroded the defenses of the UK to the point where there could have been an invasion. So radar was decisive in Europe, and nuclear weapons, of course, were decisive in Japan. So at the end of the war, there was this recognition that it had been possible to harness very fundamental science in a way that was very important to society. And a gentleman by the name of Vannevar Bush wrote this very short paper called The Endless Frontier. And this was now, we're into the late 40s, where he basically said, this was kind of a new thing. Up until that point, there had not been large federal investments in science. Science was something that was best done if you came from a wealthy family. It was kind of a hobby. There were philanthropic organizations, particularly in areas of health, that would sponsor research, but it wasn't seen as an appropriate government activity. There was no understanding that maybe there could be a societal payback. So that changed with the Second World War, and Bush wrote this Endless Frontier paper, in which he argued that, first off, we just cashed the check on this fundamental science, Maxwell's equations and nuclear science. We've turned that into useful technology, and there is more that we can do. So, for example, in the case of nuclear science, the possibilities of nuclear power, and that was an important early mission for Oak Ridge National Lab. And he made the argument that we need to replenish that reservoir of fundamental understanding in order to develop future useful applications, both for our national defense and also for the economic possibilities that were created. And he made recommendations that led to the creation of the National Science Foundation, for example, that funds a large part of the research that's done at places like the University of Tennessee and other land-grant institutions around the world. And also the creation of new agencies like DARPA, famous for things like creating the internet. Actually, another thing that I'm sure if the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Treasury had asked the people at DARPA, what use is this internet thing, they probably would have said, well, we think it's going to be important for, the defense of the country. That's what it was really built for. But there's probably no real practical application. They weren't developing the internet to create Amazon. And if you'd asked Sears Roebuck to pay for the development of the internet because of the positive effects on retail, I'm not so sure they would have been so enthusiastic about it. But there's been a huge benefit to society. So Bush kind of wrote this paper that laid out the case for a federal government role in investment in that fundamental science and some of the work to move it to the point where you could understand the application. And then very importantly, the U.S. has had, for quite some time, a very good system of legal protection for intellectual property and for the conduct of business, and a pretty irrepressible entrepreneurial thread that runs through the society. So what happened was you stitched all those things together. You had federal investments in kind of more fundamental research and moving it closer to the point where it could be used. You had aggressive entrepreneurs who are willing to take risk and bring ideas to market, and you had a legal framework where it was possible to do that and protect your intellectual property and reap the benefits. And by and large, that's the miracle, the economic miracle of the U.S. domination of the latter half of the 20th century. And you know, the economists who've studied this have estimated that roughly 50% of the real GDP growth since 1945 is due to new technology coming to the market. And you all know the magic of compound interest. If you cut that annual growth rate in half and then say, where would we be today in terms of our standard of living and how we're able to address important societal problems like poverty and health and transportation and so forth, we would be in a very different spot if you hadn't had that kind of sustained growth underpinned by technological innovation. But it's complicated. Everyone has a different role. And we're fortunate that since that time, the U.S. universities have risen to a level of international preeminence. And we have a support system of research being done in universities that's helping generate new knowledge, but probably more importantly, actually generate people equipped to deal with that new knowledge. We have institutions like the national labs who are more focused on kind of mission-driven research, where we have problems, the Department of Energy and National Security and energy and so forth, that kind of drive our research. It's not just a bottoms-up kind of activity the way it is to a greater extent at the universities. And we have the private sector that ultimately takes most of the risk, since typically the biggest cost and the biggest risk in bringing any new technology to market is when you try and scale it up. Turns out the R&D, even though if you look, Oak Ridge has a budget of about $1.5 billion a year, it's a lot of money, but on the scale of the investments that are needed to bring new technologies, the research is the cheap part. It's really the investment in the, that Y12 or K25, the manufacturing capability to go to scale where you're taking the big bets. And those are done by the private sector. So that model has been successful. And of course, what happens when you're successful is you attract imitators. People look at that and say, well, why is it that the U.S. has been able to, grow so tremendously, improve the standard of living for hundreds of millions of people, and bring all these amazing new technologies that are used all over the world into existence, and why can't I do that in my country? And so there's been a pretty systematic effort. It's like any benchmarking activity. You kind of look around and see who's doing well and try and take it apart and say, what's the elements of their success? There are certainly some pretty successful models that have followed that pattern. Obviously, in the immediate post-war period, you have the reconstruction of Germany and Japan, which have been very much on a technological advancement, advanced manufacturing, kind of higher value-added model. It took a while to get there because, you were starting from rubble. But, no one would say today that Germany and Japan are not, absolutely technologically first-rate countries that are doing innovative things. And more recently, you've seen countries like South Korea. It's a really interesting comparison that I heard someone talk about between I think it was South Korea and Peru. In the early 60s, they're about the same size in terms of population and GDP per capita in the early 60s. Now, they don't look the same today. You know, Peru, actually, you might have argued in the 60s, was in a better position than South Korea because from a natural resources point of view, it was actually, you know, wealthier in terms of its endowment of minerals and so forth, which, you know, South Korea really didn't have. And the difference was that in the 60s, in South Korea, they said, well, we don't have a lot of natural resources. Our natural resource is people, and if we can have smart people, you know, working hard on important things, maybe that's a way to drive our economy. And actually, fairly systematically, went and tried to put together that innovation ecosystem. In fact, Patel, that co-manages Oak Ridge National Lab with the University of Tennessee for the Department of Energy, was asked by Lyndon Johnson to help the South Koreans put that together and build some of their labs and conduct some of the basic research that then companies that are now you know, household names like Samsung and LG and so forth could turn into high value added products. And so as a result, you know, the South Korean GDP per capita, which, you know, sounds like a kind of wonky thing, but it's basically, do people go to bed at night well fed and warm? So it's actually a pretty important number, has way outstripped what happened in Peru, where they didn't do that. They felt like, okay, we got natural resources, we don't have to invest in all this kind of research and education. And so, you know, in the world of science, we would call that a controlled experiment. You try one thing over here, and you try another thing there, and then you look back at the results and say, which path looks better? And I think now we would say, you know, the South Koreans figured it out. They made, you know, they made their life better for millions of people. And of course, the same thing is going on in the next wave of transition from, you know, poorly developed, economically not well off, to very well developed, and you see it in China and other places around the world. So actually in China, they are being probably, I would say, even having looked at what happened with Japan and Germany and then countries like South Korea, the Chinese are taking it a step further in terms of the level of sophistication that they're applying to drive their economy. And they've got a lot of urgency behind it, because the challenge they have is they've seen, you know, since really only the last 20 years or so, very significant growth in terms of their overall standard of living and wealth. But that's driven largely by the growth in relatively low-wage manufacturing jobs of stuff that's designed elsewhere. And what happens is, as you do that, as the standards of living rise, the wages begin to rise, and you actually price yourself out of the low-wage, low-value-added market. And that's happening in China. So if you go, you know, I was at the World Economic Forum in Dalian in the fall, and the Prime Minister of China was talking about their Made in China 2025 plan. And the Made in China 2025 plan is they don't want to be doing low value added, low wage assembly of simple components designed elsewhere. They want to be doing higher value add on things that are designed and invented in China, with higher wages associated with them, because it's not just assembling kind of simple parts, but it's doing much more sophisticated things, because they need to continue their growth in GDP per capita if they're going to satisfy the demands of their population. So from a government point of view, it's about stability, it's about social stability, and, you know, continuing to meet the expectations of your population, which, you know, to be honest, is an area where there's a little bit of consternation in the US about, are we meeting the expectations of the population in terms of their aspirations, and you know, the same pressures exist in China. So at that same meeting, one of the things the Prime Minister announced was that they are planning, they're working hard to establish what they called comprehensive national labs. broad-based organizations that have a span from fundamental research to end-use application, and also provide unique high-end tools for the broader scientific community and the growing high-quality research universities that are now becoming much more prominent with institutions like Tsinghua University and Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And, you know, maybe we're not used to talking about them in the same breath that we talk about Caltech and Harvard and Oxford, but just wait, that's where they're headed. And actually, there's now a big fight going on between the all politics is regional. So this is now where we get back to the regional thing. So the Chinese Prime Minister says, we're going to establish these comprehensive national labs. He describes labs that look just like Oak Ridge, just like Argonne National Lab, just like Berkeley Lab. It's not an accident. I mean, that's exactly what they're planning to do. So what happens when you announce you're going to build these new institutions? You kick off a massive food fight between different regions in China because they want that institution in their city. And you know, they may have a very different political system from us, but in some ways it doesn't look that different. So now what's happening is Shanghai and Beijing are tripping over one another, trying to offer incentives to make sure that they get the first national lab. And Shanghai wants Oak Ridge and Beijing wants Argonne. And they're going to build, synchrotrons and supercomputers and neutron sources and advanced reactors. And actually, it winds up in the Chinese system. The local governments is where a lot of the money is, because as they've developed, the land typically belonged to the local government. So every time an Apple supplier builds a new factory, the local government gets money from that. So the city of Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing have, relatively speaking, I mean, they're pretty big cities, first off, so they're as large as a lot of countries. But they also have a revenue stream that in some ways outstrips the resources of the federal government. And so, and they're building facilities. When I was in Shanghai in the spring, I visited the site of their proposed Oak Ridge National Lab. It's in the Pudong area near the high-speed train station and the brand new, well, it's not that new, but pretty new airport. They have a synchrotron, which is an X-ray source for studying materials. They've got a beautiful new free electron laser, essentially similar to the one that's in Palo Alto at the SLAC facility, which is another DOE lab. They've got an array of nuclear magnetic resonance machines, NMR machines for doing biology. There's a protein institute that's using the synchrotron to study proteins, and they're building a supercomputer. And there's a brand new university called Shanghai Tech, which is modeled on Caltech. And they are getting the best graduate students from all over China to go there. And they're doing, absolutely groundbreaking fundamental science, but the reason that the Shanghai regional government wants to make sure that that facility is there is because all of those facilities and all of that research and all of those people are ultimately going to turn into those high value added products that will be made in China 2025. That's their national economic development agenda. They don't want, when you buy your Apple computer, it says you turn it over and it says designed in California, but it's actually made in Guangzhou or Shanghai. What that means is a lot of that economic value is really captured by Apple. It's not captured by the parts suppliers who are doing the manufacturing. Now, it happens to be captured by Apple and largely left overseas for reasons that I won't get into, since I'm not going to discuss tax reform, because Dave Keim said people would tweet things if I said anything controversial. It's a very deliberate effort to look at what worked for us, understand it, and in a systematic way go about and make those investments and try and recreate that innovation ecosystem where you have Shanghai Tech, brand new university churning out bright graduates. You have the I have to remember the name, it's named after Jiang Zemin, who was the president of China, who was from Shanghai, this national lab that they're creating. And it's in a thing called the Jiang Zemin Innovation District. There's a bunch of companies there too that are co-locating. So there are pharmaceutical companies that are co-locating there because they want to use the synchrotrons and the supercomputers. And you know, they're international pharmaceutical companies. It's Swiss, US, British that are going there. And the main reason they're going there, it's not so much about the facilities, it's actually about the people. That's what really drives the development. It's the movement of, it's the brain circulation. When I was, I think in the introduction you mentioned I had a postdoc at AT&T Bell Labs, which is kind of a famous research place. No longer exists in its current form, but you know, they develop things like fiber optics for communications, the laser, a little thing called semiconductors. You know, some pretty big impacts flowed out of that. And one of the physicists who was a group leader that I worked for said, you know, don't talk to me about all this tech transfer stuff, legal mumbo jumbo. The only tech transfer I care about is the moving van that brings the graduate student from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Murray Hill, New Jersey. That's tech transfer. And actually, that same thing has played out in this region. So if you look, and Innovation Valley did this a couple years ago, sort of did a study of, you know, what are the business characteristics in the East Tennessee, Greater Knoxville, Innovation Valley area that maybe look a little bit different than you would find in other areas? What's the fingerprint in terms of the areas that we have lots of economic activity? And the result of that was, you know, some things that you would expect. I mean, obviously the automotive industry is very important for the state of Tennessee, and we have a component of that. But there's also a cluster of activities here around the area of instrumentation. For you know, medical diagnostics and nuclear plant instrumentation and that sort of thing. And you can say, well, you know, why is that? Well, the reason it is because we got this thing called Oak Ridge National Lab, where we had people, you know, back in the 60s, we were building detectors for physics experiments. You couldn't buy them. It was, you know, that was not something that has a big market. So we had an instrumentation and controls division that would build detectors and build electronics for those detectors. And actually in the early 60s we had what effectively are the first two spin-outs from the lab, a company called Ortec and another one called Tenelec. Kind of names give you a hint of where they came from. And the reason they were created, that was before there was all this kind of framework of Bayh-Dole Act in the 80s that talked about the framework for intellectual property protection around government-funded research and didn't exist. So at that time, they were just kind of improvising, and they were also, the lab was kind of frustrated because they were getting all these requests from other labs around the world, build us a detector, your guys are the best in the world, you know, we need a detector. And they were trying to, you know, their colleagues, and so they were trying to respond to that, but they had other stuff that they needed to do, and this was becoming a distraction. So some of the researchers said, well, maybe we could start a company, and then that would mean that the lab didn't have to be building detectors and, you know, diverting its resources. So a group wrote a letter to the then lab director, Alvin Weinberg, saying we want to start this company. We think that there's enough interest that we can probably, you know, sell some of these detectors, and that way the lab won't have to worry about it. Alvin Weinberg was the director at the time, and he later said if he'd been in town, he would have denied it. He would have disapproved it. But he was out of town, so his deputy signed off on it. They promised, you know, they said, look, we'll do it on weekends and evenings. We're not going to use any laboratory resources. It'll be fine. They raised money. They went to, you know, a group of friends and got $5,000 each, which is, you know, kind of a lot of money in 1963, and started production. This is Ortec, and actually in about 1970, that company got sold to Canberra, and all those early investors got a pretty tidy return on investment for their initial $5,000 investment, and is subsequently bought by Oxford Instruments. Even more importantly, actually, there were a bunch of people involved in that who weren't really so interested in going to work for a big company that had acquired them. They wanted to do another startup. So they started a little company called CTI, which I'm sure most of you know the story of. Now, CTI, which eventually grew to have about a third of the market for PET CT scanners by the time it was bought by Siemens for, I think, $900 million, had no intellectual property from Oak Ridge National Lab in it. So we weren't developing technologies that were licensed to CTI. But if you look at the people who were involved, the reason that it could be successful is because there were people around who'd, worked as students at the lab, or worked at the lab and then gone to Ortec, or there was this local innovation ecosystem of expertise in this area of instrumentation and medical imaging and so forth. And if you look at a lot of any time any economic development agency makes a strategic plan, I don't care whether it's Innovation Valley or, the Red River or Innovation something, all over the country, they're always the first paragraph complains about the fact, we're not Silicon Valley. We don't have access to capital. We don't have a culture of accepting failure, and kind of list all these things that people think. The real reason why Silicon Valley is because they've got a concentration of people who know how to build and grow companies in the general kind of IT space. So if you want to start a software company that's going to make an app, and you need a CFO who understands that business, or you're going to make devices and you need someone who understands how to stand up the manufacturing arm, or you need human resources people who can recruit tech weenies or whatever, they're all going to be in that area, and they will have all done it before. Well, if you want to start a company that's going to do instrumentation controls, or bring new materials into the automotive sector, or any of those sectors that are in our regional footprint, it's going to be a whole lot easier here. You would never do it in Silicon Valley. Costs are too high and they don't have the expertise. And I think that's the reason why there's this food fight in China, because they recognize that the creation of these national labs is going to create these technology footprints that will be different in each of the regions, but they'll be able to leverage it to grow their local economy. So the national government is investing because they see this challenge of continuing to grow the GDP per capita, moving to higher wage, high value added jobs. So their role is, let's get that fundamental science going and get research into our universities and all that sort of stuff. The local governments are saying, that's great, you're going to create all these high wage jobs. We'd really like them to be here. If you're in Shanghai, you're not so interested in high wage jobs in Guangzhou. And that interplay of the kind of national policy and national investments with actions that are being taken in regions to leverage their special strengths, that's what I think the secret sauce is. And I would say we made a lot of progress in this region in the now 19 years that I've been here. Doesn't mean there's not more to do, but Oak Ridge National Lab is very fortunate, I think, in our location, because we have a region around us that's interested in what we're doing. They may not always know what it is. There's still a lot of people who think that the lab is in the nuclear weapons business, which we're not. We're in the open science and energy and engineering and innovation and high-performance computing business. But people are interested in what we're doing. That translates into support. It means we have a very supportive system around us in terms of both local, state, and federal, all of which are important. And I think we've got the opportunity to kind of have the kind of entrepreneurial environment that'll be good for the region, but it's also very good for the lab. And that's why we're interested, because in the end, we are funded by the taxpayer based on some payback to society, because we're supposed to be helping do the underlying science to create those high-wage jobs. And we don't make anything and we don't sell anything. So we have to have people around us who are interested in doing that, and I think we do. So I think the question, given all those opportunities, is, are we going to be able to take advantage of them? And I hope we are. So I think with that, I'll stop, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yep.
You've made a compelling case for the role of science and technology in economic development, whether it's in the United States in the last century or South Korea, China's plans. What is your view of the talent pipeline coming into our national lab, six that you'll be managing? Are those future scientists and developers, are they all going to work for Google, or are they coming into the national labs, and does the federal government have a role in supporting and attracting that science talent pipeline?
So I know the numbers best for Oak Ridge. We've actually, for a couple of reasons, been recruiting a lot of people over the last 10 years or so, both because of growth. We got new programs with our supercomputers and the spallation neutron source, and also because a lot of people joined the labs in the 70s after the Arab oil embargo, and so there was a big growth, and if you do the math, many of those people have become eligible for retirement, and some of them actually retire, so we've had to replace. And so as a result, over 70% of our PhD scientists and engineers have been with us less than 10 years. So we have a lot of new faces. Now, they're not all early career, but a lot of them are. And I would say, when I interact with our new staff, in fact, just last week we had we have a new employee orientation, and so sometimes I'll go and different members of the leadership team will go talk to them. So I talked to a group of, 24 new staff members last week. We are getting absolutely first-rate people. So I'm really excited about how excited these new staff who've joined the lab have been to get engaged in our mission and drive the technology forward. So on that front, I feel pretty good that we've got wicked smart people who are highly motivated. Will work really hard to solve important problems. There are some challenges. There are not enough graduates being produced in the U.S. in the areas of science and technology, of U.S. citizens in the areas of science and technology that were active. Over 50% of the PhD students in physical sciences and engineering are foreign nationals. Now that's fine, I'm a foreign national, that's okay. But part of the reason is because not enough young people in the U.S. are electing to pursue those career pathways, and we've been fortunate that we've been able to compensate by being, the beacon that attracts everyone from all over the world. Starting with the refugee scientists in the Manhattan Project who fled Germany because of persecution and then helped end the war in our favor. But, more recently, if you look at startups in Silicon Valley, something like 60% of them have people who typically came to the U.S. to get educated and then chose to stay. So that has been very successful. It's, to be honest, getting pretty tricky now. I mean, we're already seeing the system gum up in terms of visa applications and everything. And if you talk to you talk to a university president, they're seeing pretty dramatic shifts in terms of the incoming student population as well. So people aren't even waiting to have the visa problems. They're choosing to go to places like Canada and Australia and elsewhere. So that's a challenge because, we need smart people to do our job. That's what we're funded to do, and that looks like it's not going to be as easy. You can sort of look at this different ways. You said, is everyone going to go work at Google? Well, from the lab point of view, I hope not everyone goes to work at Google because we need them at the lab. But on the other hand, if you have people who come, spend time, learn, and go on to do something else, that's also good. That's part of the value that we provide. So circulation is a healthy thing. And we've certainly worked hard to try and do more of that. So we have a new, it's not that new now, new graduate program with UT called the Bredesen Center. In fact, after here, I'm going over to meet with former Governor Bredesen and the Bredesen Center students as they do their presentations from one of their classes. And that's going to have people coming into the lab to do their thesis research, and we might hire some of them. We already have, and we will probably hire more of them. Some of them will go work in industry, some will go to other national labs, some will go to universities, but that'll be a network that remains connected to the lab. So when they go to their faculty position somewhere else, they'll send their students. If they're working in industry and they have some important problem they're trying to solve in materials characterization because of a manufacturing flaw that's occurring. I know someone back at Oak Ridge who can solve that problem. So, the circulation is okay as long as it doesn't become lopsided. And so if we get into a situation where people aren't motivated to come to the lab, and we can't compete from a compensation point of view. I mean, we're never going to compete with the Googles and so forth. We don't have stock options. We're a federal institution. But, as long as the mission support is there and the mission commitment, you don't have to necessarily throw stock options at people. But if that starts to undermine, if people aren't convinced that there's an important mission for them to go and solve that has the full support of the government behind it, and we can't keep pace in a competitive environment for smart people, then, down the road we could get in trouble. But in terms of who we've got right now, they're absolutely top-notch, and they're going to do amazing things. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you.